Picture this: Friedrich Nietzsche, the hammer-wielding philosopher who declared the death of God and called for the creation of new values, somehow finds himself in 2025, scrolling through YouTube and stumbling upon Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life lectures. What would the man who wrote Beyond Good and Evil make of this weeping Canadian professor who tells young men to clean their rooms and stand up straight? The answer, I suspect, would be a mixture of horror, disgust, and dark amusement, followed by the kind of philosophical evisceration that would make his critique of Socrates look like a love letter. To understand why Nietzsche would view Peterson with such contempt, we must first grasp what Nietzsche actually stood for, because Peterson's interpretation of Nietzschean philosophy is so fundamentally backwards that it's almost impressive in its wrongness. Nietzsche wasn't a self-help guru dispensing life advice to depressed millennials. He was a cultural diagnostician who saw Western civilization as fundamentally sick, propped up by life-denying values that had turned humanity into a herd of comfortable, mediocre sheep. His entire philosophical project was aimed at destroying the old value system and creating space for something genuinely new and life-affirming to emerge. Peterson, by contrast, is the ultimate defender of the status quo dressed up in the language of rebellion. He tells his followers to clean their rooms, respect hierarchies, and return to traditional values, precisely the kind of bourgeois respectability that Nietzsche spent his career demolishing. When Peterson talks about taking responsibility, he's advocating for what Nietzsche would recognize as slave morality par excellence, the idea that we should accept our circumstances, make the best of what we have, and find meaning through duty and obligation rather than through the creation of new values. The irony is breathtaking. Peterson has built his entire brand on misappropriating Nietzschean concepts while embodying everything Nietzsche despised. Take Peterson's obsession with hierarchies, which he justifies through his famous lobster analogy. Peterson argues that hierarchies are natural and necessary, that we should learn to navigate them skillfully, and that there's something noble about climbing the social ladder. Nietzsche would have seen this as the perfect example of what he called herd morality, the tendency to judge human worth by social position and to accept existing power structures as natural and inevitable. For Nietzsche, the truly noble individual, the one he called the Übermensch, doesn't climb hierarchies, they create their own values and live according to their own standards. The Übermensch is beyond good and evil not because they're immoral, but because they've transcended the conventional moral categories that keep most people trapped in mediocrity. Peterson's advice to stand up straight with your shoulders back would strike Nietzsche as the kind of posturing that weak people do when they're desperately trying to fit into a system that fundamentally diminishes them. But perhaps what would disgust Nietzsche most about Peterson is his relationship to suffering. Peterson has built his philosophy around the idea that life is fundamentally tragic and that the best we can do is bear our suffering with dignity. He tells his followers that meaning comes from accepting responsibility for their pain and finding ways to endure it. This is precisely the kind of life-denying philosophy that Nietzsche identified as the core problem of Western civilization. Nietzsche didn't want people to accept their suffering, he wanted them to overcome it, to transform it into something creative and life-affirming. When Nietzsche wrote about the will to power, he wasn't talking about the kind of social climbing that Peterson advocates. He was describing the fundamental drive to create, to overcome obstacles, to impose one's will on the world in ways that affirm life rather than merely endure it. Peterson's philosophy is fundamentally reactive. It's about responding to the world as it is rather than actively creating new possibilities. Nietzsche would have seen this as the essence of decadence, the sign of a culture that has lost its vital force and can only manage decline rather than create genuine renewal. The religious dimension of Peterson's philosophy would be equally appalling to Nietzsche. Peterson presents himself as a defender of Christian values while claiming to be influenced by Nietzschean thought, apparently unaware that Nietzsche saw Christianity as one of the most life-denying forces in human history. When Peterson talks about the psychological truth of biblical stories or the importance of traditional religious frameworks, he's advocating for exactly the kind of slave morality that Nietzsche spent his career attacking. Nietzsche's famous declaration that God is dead wasn't a celebration, it was a diagnosis of a cultural crisis that demanded a creative response. The old religious and moral frameworks that had given meaning to human existence for centuries were no longer viable, and rather than trying to resurrect them or find psychological ways to make them relevant, Nietzsche called for the creation of entirely new values. Peterson's attempt to salvage Christian morality through Jungian psychology would strike Nietzsche as exactly the kind of intellectual dishonesty that prevents genuine cultural renewal. Consider how Peterson talks about truth. He's famous for his evasive answer to the question, "Do you believe God exists?" where he refuses to give a straight answer and instead talks about the pragmatic value of religious belief. This is precisely the kind of philosophical cowardice that Nietzsche associated with the decline of Western civilization. Nietzsche demanded intellectual honesty above all else, the courage to face difficult truths even when they're uncomfortable. Peterson's willingness to treat truth as subordinate to psychological comfort would be, for Nietzsche, a perfect example of the kind of weakness that masquerades as wisdom. The way Peterson has built his public persona would also be deeply offensive to Nietzsche's sensibilities. Peterson presents himself as a martyr for free speech and traditional values, constantly emphasizing his own suffering and the price he's paid for speaking truth to power. This victimhood narrative would strike Nietzsche as the height of slave morality, the tendency to derive moral authority from one's suffering rather than from one's creative achievements. The noble individual, in Nietzsche's vision, doesn't seek sympathy or validation from others. They create their own standards and live according to them regardless of social approval. Peterson's famous emotional breakdowns during interviews and lectures would be particularly galling to Nietzsche, who valued emotional self-mastery and saw uncontrolled emotion as a sign of weakness. When Peterson weeps while talking about the meaning of life or the importance of responsibility, he's displaying exactly the kind of emotional incontinence that Nietzsche associated with decadent cultures. The strong individual, according to Nietzsche, transforms their pain into art, philosophy, or creative achievement rather than displaying it publicly as a badge of authenticity. The intellectual sloppiness that characterizes Peterson's work would be another source of Nietzschean contempt. Peterson routinely makes grand claims about human nature, mythology, and psychology without the kind of rigorous scholarship that such claims require. He cherry-picks from various disciplines: evolutionary biology, psychology, anthropology, religious studies, to support conclusions he's already reached rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. This is precisely the kind of intellectual dishonesty that Nietzsche saw as characteristic of systematic thinkers who care more about defending their worldview than about pursuing truth. Nietzsche valued intellectual courage and the willingness to follow ideas to their logical conclusions even when those conclusions are disturbing or socially unacceptable. Peterson, by contrast, seems to have decided in advance that traditional values are worth defending and then constructs elaborate justifications for conclusions he's already reached. This backwards approach to thinking would strike Nietzsche as fundamentally dishonest, the kind of rationalization that prevents genuine philosophical insight. The way Peterson treats his followers would also be deeply problematic from a Nietzschean perspective. Peterson has cultivated a kind of cult of personality where his admirers treat him as a father figure and seek his guidance on everything from career decisions to relationship advice. This kind of intellectual dependency is exactly what Nietzsche warned against when he wrote, "One repays a teacher badly if one always remains nothing but a pupil." Nietzsche wanted his readers to eventually surpass him, to use his ideas as stepping stones to their own creative achievements rather than as final authorities. Peterson, by contrast, seems to encourage intellectual dependency. His followers don't engage critically with his ideas, they simply apply them as received wisdom. This creates exactly the kind of herd mentality that Nietzsche saw as the enemy of genuine human flourishing. The strong individual, according to Nietzsche, doesn't need a guru or a father figure. They create their own meaning and live according to their own standards. Perhaps most fundamentally, Peterson and Nietzsche have completely opposite attitudes toward human potential. Peterson's philosophy is fundamentally pessimistic despite its therapeutic packaging. He sees human beings as fundamentally flawed creatures who need structure, tradition, and authority to prevent them from descending into chaos. His entire worldview is built on the assumption that most people are too weak to create their own values and need to be guided by time-tested wisdom and social hierarchies. Nietzsche, despite his reputation as a pessimist, was actually profoundly optimistic about human potential. He believed that human beings were capable of genuine greatness, of creating new values and new forms of life that would surpass anything that had come before. His critique of existing values wasn't meant to lead people back to traditional frameworks, it was meant to clear space for something genuinely new and life-affirming to emerge. In the end, Nietzsche would likely view Peterson as a perfect example of what he called the last man, the comfortable, risk-averse individual who has given up on the possibility of genuine greatness and settled for a life of small pleasures and modest achievements. Peterson's philosophy offers his followers exactly what the last man wants, a way to feel meaningful and responsible without actually having to create anything new or take genuine risks. Peterson has appropriated Nietzschean language and concepts to sell a philosophy that is fundamentally anti-Nietzschean. He's taken the most radical and challenging philosopher in the Western tradition and turned him into a self-help guru for people who want to feel rebellious without actually rebelling against anything important. If Nietzsche were alive today, he would probably see Peterson not as a worthy opponent but as a symptom of the very cultural decay he spent his life diagnosing, a fake philosopher for fake rebels who want the appearance of depth without the substance of genuine transformation. The irony is that Peterson's misappropriation of Nietzschean concepts has probably done more to domesticate and neutralize Nietzsche's radical vision than any academic critic ever could. By turning the philosopher of creative destruction into a guru of personal responsibility, Peterson has made Nietzsche safe for bourgeois consumption, which is perhaps the greatest insult of all to a thinker who saw bourgeois respectability as the enemy of everything noble in human nature. Nietzsche would have viewed Jordan Peterson not as a fellow philosopher but as a symptom of everything wrong with contemporary culture, a weak man pretending to be strong, a conservative masquerading as a rebel, and a defender of slave morality wrapped in the language of liberation. In short, Peterson represents exactly the kind of intellectual and spiritual mediocrity that Nietzsche spent his career trying to overcome.